Hello, this is the first in a series of videos I'm making on Alistair Parker's book, The Second World War, A Short History. This is about Chapter 1, which is a general overview of the political background to the origins of the European War. I've divided it into 4 bits. The first video today is on Hitler's rise to power in Germany. Then next week we'll talk about Hitler in power, and then move on to Britain and British policy in the immediate pre-war period, and finally the Polish crisis and French policy in the pre-war period. Obviously, this is an enormous area about which one could have an entire book, and so Parker's summarized it in one chapter, so necessarily it's very brief, and if you want more details about the political ins and outs of the period, you'll have to read further. So first of all, the general point that for Parker, as for most people, the Second World War can be seen as 2 separate wars, one in Europe and the other one in East Asia and the Pacific, although in Parker's case, unlike some writers, he doesn't go back to the Japanese-Chinese War from 1937, but begins with the Japanese expansion in 1941. He makes 2 or 3 general points. One is that Germany and Japan fought separately. Britain and the United States, on the other hand, fought both Germany and Japan, and the Soviet Union fought mostly against Germany until right at the end of the war. Choices and consequences. The war was caused by conflict between the actions and rulers of Germany and Japan, and what the governments and political influential sections of the population of Britain, France, and the United States thought was acceptable. In 1939, Poland chose to fight, encouraged by Britain and France, rather than accept the loss of independence to Germany. In 1940, Mussolini in Italy voluntarily sided with Germany because he thought, mistakenly, that the war was already won. Many other countries didn't have a choice to fight or to be fought over. Towards the end of the war, many more states joined into the war in order to qualify as founder members of the United Nations, but generally their participation was quite nominal. The British, French, and Polish initial response is important, but it's the German government that started World War II. Japan only attacked Britain and its empire in the United States because the German war had already begun. Hitler's rule in Germany was paradoxical, his government being both popular and unrepresentative. Few Germans would have approved in advance of Hitler's expansionism or his violent and murderous actions, but initially his dictatorship seems to have won the approval of most Germans for several years, and there was nearly complete acquiescence until almost the end of the war. Popular support depended on ignorance of what results the regime would bring. So it would have been difficult to attain the national objectives which most Germans desired. They wouldn't have necessarily led to a great European war. For that to happen required the special ferocity and recklessness of Nazi foreign policy. Up until 1940 at least, there was a general approval for Hitler's foreign policy. The apparent aims of that policy coincided with what most politically minded Germans wanted. They didn't know that he wanted, in the end, a self-inflicted struggle for survival. In terms of popular appeal, in 1932, German voters had shown widespread approval for the Nazis, and in the 2 national elections of that year, the Nazis had polled 37% and 33% of the votes cast in the 2 Reichstag votes. But Hitler came to power because of powerful non-Nazi politicians who preferred to try to work with the Nazis and exploit them, rather than ally with the socialists and oppose them. The economic crisis of that time had generated resentment and fear, which combined with alleged political injustices explain the mass support for a nationalist and authoritarian party. For the success of the Nazis and Hitler's eventual winning of German acquiescence in an aggressive foreign policy, it was essential that Germans blamed their economic and political grievances on the Versailles Treaty and on its enforcement by foreign predators, as they saw them. Most Germans did not feel any guilt for World War I and didn't accept that the reparations and other consequences of the Versailles Treaty were fair. Rather, they saw them as unjust and ruinous. Most Germans blamed the great inflation of 1923 and the resultant collapse of the currency and of economic life, as well as the post-1929 slump, on foreign vengeance, especially by the French. Actually, the inflation was largely the consequences of German resistance to reparations, and the slump to a combination of the withdrawal of capital by American investors who had no hostile motive towards Germany, and the rigorously deflationary policies of the German government. There were, however, some foreign attitudes which fueled German suspicion, notably the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 and French reluctance to cooperate in easing pressure on German banks in 1931. The Versailles Treaty itself fueled xenophobic nationalism, especially with Poles governing Germans in the New Poland, and some Germans also being upset that German-speaking Austria wasn't allowed to join Germany, and with the rule of Czechs over Germans in some parts of Czechoslovakia after the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Special interest groups were also upset at the loss of the German colonies, and a very influential section of Germans resented the treaty limitations on the size and equipment of the German army. Support for the Nazis stemmed both from hatred of foreigners and economic panic during the economic depression of 1929-32. The Nazis denounced both the socialists and communists as unpatriotic, internationally minded tools of alien exploitation and hatred. Socialist subversion, they said, had led to German defeat in 1918, and in the 1920s they also attacked agents of capitalist liberalism, particularly the powerful politician of that period, Stresemann, who had been apostle of Germany fulfilling the Versailles Treaty and following Allied direction. After 1929, Germany was the hardest hit of the major industrial powers by the Great Depression, and this was Germany's second economic catastrophe of the economic period. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest political party. In terms of a support base, few working men turned to the Nazis. The combined vote of the socialists and communists remained constant. Mass support for the Nazis came instead, especially from the middle classes and peasants. The middle class readily blamed the depression on socialist ideas, especially the supposedly selfish and short-sighted trade unions. For the middle class, working class resistance to downward pressure on wages and to reductions of public spending on social welfare was foolish and harmed everyone, postponing the economic recovery which would result from a reduction of wage costs and maintaining confidence in the currency. The Nazis made a show of appealing to the working class, but the Nazi Party really worked with others. The Nazis claimed to be classless and to stand for the state as a whole and government over class conflict, and opposed the wastefulness of leftist deputies. They appealed to men of impartiality and moderation, they said. The Nazis promised vigorous struggle against the communists, the most extreme advocates of class struggle, a welcome idea to those who feared the fragility of the social framework and feared its overthrow. The Nazis insisted on the need for self-sacrificing cooperation for the general good. This gave their cause a reformist appeal to anti-leftists. The Nazis gained a lot of support from young voters, perhaps objecting to class-based parties which dominated the German scene. The only non-leftist party to keep its voting strength significantly was the Centre Party, associated with the Roman Catholic Church and also not based on class. The Nazis' claim to transcend class conflicts was also supported by their hostility to the individualistic excesses attributed to international capitalism. Successful capitalists were presented as conspiratorial scoundrels. This appealed to debtors and struggling peasants and smallholders, hit hard by falling prices and the tendency of Weimar governments, especially Brüning's, to favor grain growers over livestock producers. Though it was obvious that Nazis would discriminate against Jews if coming to power, few voters could have expected the wartime program of organized murder. In 1932, Nazi anti-Semitism probably alienated more Germans than it attracted. It did appeal to some, however, though it's not possible to be precise about this, but it may well have appealed to those peasants who resented their indebtedness to muddied men, whom the Nazis often portrayed as being Jewish, small shopkeepers who resented competition from large stores, professionals, lawyers and doctors who blamed their occupational failure on supposed unfair competition from Jews with their cultural or religious cohesiveness, again imagined. Those who voted for Nazis felt or feared deprivation. The Nazis encouraged and exploited suspicion between social groups, whilst claiming for themselves to represent a united nation. In all elections prior to Hitler becoming Chancellor, the majority of Germans voted against the Nazis. That is round about 2/3 of the total. To come to power, the Nazis needed the help of non-Nazis. It would not have been possible for them to mount an armed seizure of power, given that the police and army would have been loyal to President Field Marshal Hindenburg and the ministers appointed by him. Let me just introduce you to Hindenburg. This is Paul von Hindenburg, President of Germany from 1925 until 1934, already in his late 70s when he came to this high office, a major figure in World War I and regarded by certainly conservative Germans as a sort of father figure of the nation. I should say also that, although this isn't mentioned in the book, that the presidency in the Weimar Constitution was very significant and had a lot of reserve powers, so he wasn't just a figurehead. This is effectively the last real Weimar Chancellor, Prime Minister of Germany before everything turns really chaotic. This was Heinrich Brüning, who was Chancellor from 1930 and 1932 and had to deal, unsuccessfully as it happened, with the enormous problems of the Depression. Notably, again not mentioned in the book, he was wise enough to flee Germany after the Nazis came to power for fear of reprisals they might take against him, and he ended up in America with an academic position. So, in 1930, Brüning was appointed Chancellor after the previous government had split over whether government spending should be reduced by cutting the cost of defense or of cutting the cost of poor relief. Hindenburg and his advisors expected Brüning to avoid dependence on the Socialist Party in the Reichstag so that he could maintain or increase defense spending. But the realities of party politics in the Reichstag meant that without Nazi support, Brüning was forced to rely on the concealed or half-concealed support of the socialists. In 1932, for example, the socialists in provisional governments, where they were often very powerful, began to insist that the Nazis should be curbed, especially the violence of the Nazi stormtroopers. Brüning was thus forced to work with the socialists against the Nazis. This collaboration was embodied in the presidential elections of 1932, when Hindenburg was backed by the socialists so as to prevent Hitler from winning. For Hindenburg and his close advisors, this was an unwelcome alliance. They wanted to weaken socialism and strengthen the army. Therefore, Brüning was ousted as chancellor, and Franz von Papen took his place. Von Papen, who was a conservative aristocrat, suppressed the government of Prussia, in which socialist ministers held key positions, and offered Hitler the vice-chancellorship. But Hitler refused the offer of a subordinate position and denied von Papen Nazi votes in the Reichstag. The army also rejected the idea of a military dictatorship presided over by von Papen, since according to its political mouthpiece, General von Schleicher, it was not strong enough to simultaneously combat the Nazis, the socialists, and the communists. These are the two men who briefly served as chancellors right at the end and decline of collapse of the Weimar Republic. So Franz von Papen, who was briefly chancellor in 1932 for several months, and then the army's political mouthpiece, if you like, and an accomplished political schemer, General Kurt von Schleicher, who was very briefly chancellor in December 32, January 33. You'll notice his very early death date in 1934. After Hitler came to power, he was one of those politicians who was marked for murder under Hitler's command. So von Schleicher came to power as Chancellor in December 1932, trying to work with the trade unions and also to split the Nazis to weaken Hitler. In this effort he failed. So by January 1933 the choice was between renewed dependence on the socialists, military rule, or accepting Hitler's terms for cooperation by appointing him Chancellor. Hindenburg was persuaded, especially by von Papen and General Blomberg from the army, that the interest of the army and German conservatives could be pursued, even with Hitler as Chancellor. Here's an official photograph of Hitler from 1932. He became German Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933 and held that post until his death in April 45. And also the additional title of Führer, of leader, from August 34 and again until his death. That's what I'm going to say for the moment. Many thanks, as always, to everyone for listening, and particularly to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which these videos wouldn't get made. You're very welcome to support my channel. Like and share the videos if you want to. Please do comment on them if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, Hitler in power. Have a good day.